Good to see all of you. I ask you to open the Chumashim, page 828. 828, for those who have other Chumashim, it's book of Bamidbar, chapter 11, verse 10 and onward. The subject I would like to talk to you today is the subject of dealing with uncertainty. In our lives, especially since the virus took place, we are facing great amount of unknown. For some people is an opportunity, for others is a great fear or trepidation for the unknown future. So with that in mind, we need to find a source of inspiration and source of understanding from our blueprint of life, which is our Torah. And part of our belief is that in a weekly Torah portion is always we find some logical or direct reasoning for the current events and the situations that we are facing day by day. So here, in a very short narrative of the text, we're dealing with almost typical human behavior, or if you want to go to the extreme, you can say that it's typical Jewish, meaning people, either in Yiddish you call it krachten, or in English you say it complainers, and you do not need to attend any board meeting or congregation meeting to find some people who have something to complain about something. But I see your faces, it's okay, you can laugh at that, nobody hear you at this point. And all the questions, please, just a little later. And it turns out that many times there's no reason to complain, or there's no reason to feel the way certain people feel. So in this particular case, it's a very interesting dialogue, so result of those complainers, between Moshe Rabbeinu, between Moses and the Almighty God. They left Egypt, they were slaves, they saw a tremendous amount of miracles. One of the greatest miracles was a manna from heaven. They have food, they have sustenance, they have whatever they need. They saw miracle, as we said in the Haggadah, at least 100, maybe 250, but many miracles happened there. But there are a certain segment of people, some say that it's those who join them with Egyptians that really have no interest in being part of Jewish destiny, but be as it may, there are minority who raise their complaint. What is exactly their complaint? And they said, we have manna from heaven, we have the food, whatever we need, but that's boring, we want to have meat. And the text, if you look at the verse, they said, Vayichar af, meaning the Almighty was tremendous, very angry, and in the eye of Moses was Ra, was distress, was wicked, evil, whatever you use the proper word. And it turned so bad that now it switched. Instead of the Almighty speak to Moses saying, here Moses speak to the Lord. And he said, why you do so much wrong in a way to me? I'm your servant, I'm willing and ready to do whatever you ask me to do. And I did not bore this nation, but you put such a tremendous burden on me to carry these people. I didn't born them, I didn't do all that, and look what they are doing. You're asking me to carry them, you see the next verse, as the mother carried the baby, and those babies, those people behavior, it's enough. And it turns so bad that it's basically first time clearly in the text that Moses said to God, if you keep doing that to me this way, guess what, verse 15, take away my life. I don't want to continue doing what you ask me to do anymore. And as a result, change took place. God said, all right, appointed not 1, not 5, 70, which is the formulation later on of the great Supreme Rabbinic Court. 70 elders, wise people, experienced people, people who have a great wisdom, knowledge, spirituality, and wisdom, and let them, in a way, delegate to them, and let them handle the people and more. Now, the truth of the matter, it's not unheard in the entire Tanakh, and the entire Torah, the entire Bible, that the great leaders of our nation, in a way, negotiate with God, have a strong dialogue, almost like in our human, anthropomorphic human language, almost ask God for something against God's wishes. Take, for example, the Midrash of Noah with the destruction of the great flood. Take the text of Abraham, who negotiated with God over the destruction of those cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe there are 45, maybe there are 30, maybe 20, maybe even 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. Please God, don't destroy them. Moses himself, we discussed it not long ago, when it was a great disappointment ever. You walk out with the tablets, and all of a sudden there are people who dance around golden calf, and God said, let me annihilate this nation. Moses begged him and said, don't do that. You see the mechanism between all those biblical names, a new approach from our leadership. We discussed several times the difference between power and influence. The two different things. Our spiritual leaders, since the ancient times, never seek power. Even the prophets are called teachers. Prophet Jonah, as we read on Yom Kippur, warned the people that the city of Nineveh will be destroyed if they don't do teshuvah, did not change their mind. People follow, and it didn't happen. So it's kind of teachers. But there is another side of leadership, which is the key side in the Jewish approach, which is influence. Not seeking power, but have an influence. And one of the great leaders, obviously, was Moshe Rabbeinu, was Moses. But what you see, the mechanism of all this great leadership, is the idea that sometimes, in a certain condition, certain time, in the position of such a great influence on a community and a leadership, you see a leader that go out of his way either to protect the people or to negotiate or even command to do something different. I'm sure you remember the story of Korach and Moses, when Moses asked God to create a phenomena that never happened before. It wasn't God's request. Moses asked to have the earthquake to open its mouth and swallow Korach and its people, and it happens. Almost like saying, again, kivyachol in our human language, that Moses commanding God to do something against the structure, the nature, the decorum of the world. From that point, I want to share with you a little bit, getting in a way close to our times, a Hasidic story. And I see your faces. You should know that in every faith group, you can go pick a faith group. Makes no difference which are they. There are always legends and stories and more. Some of them, they hold more authentic and true, some of them less. But the framework of the story is more important to focus more than the exact details and the authenticity of the story. But again, according to a lot of Hasidic tales, you find it in many places written, was a great rabbi of a community by the name of Rabbi Shlomo Luria. Now, we should not mix Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal of the 16th century, of Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who lived at the early 15th century, about 500 years ago. If you click on Rabbi Google or whatever you choose, Rabbi Yahoo, you click the word Maharshal, M-A-H-A-R-S-H-A-L, you can see from Wikipedia to Google and many other sources the legend and story about this great rabbi, community leader, and more. So in very short, the Maharshal wrote extensively a lot of responsa, a lot of Talmudic and rabbinic interpretation about every rabbinic school. They study his materials. Even people who just study Mishnah and Talmud study some of his books are Chochmat Shlomo, Yam Shel Shlomo. Some rabbis will tell you that the Maharshal is the foundation, the backbone of the Talmudic interpretation, follow Rashi and Tosfot and others. But here is a story about Maharshal, not so much as a great Talmudist, not so much as a spiritual leader of a community in Poland, not only as the head of yeshiva in Lublin in those days in Poland, very well-known rabbinic school, but as a more spiritual leader of a community. The story is, and again, it's one of those legends that I personally, when I heard it many years ago in rabbinic school, I was very moved and attached to that story, and I hope you take it to heart. So here is the story. In his village, in his city in Poland, the Maharshal was the Mara de Astro. Mara de Astro meaning the rabbi who in charge of anything and everything spiritually in the community. In those days, it wasn't a modern day administration and board and things like that we see in a modern day United States. It's the way the community runs in Poland. Everything comes and start and end with the rabbi. So it was a yeshiva student. In those days, they got married at the early 20s, and yeshiva student was matched with a girl in the community. The Maharshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, performed the wedding, and for many years they have no kids, no children. In other words, the legend said that it was about 10 years that they are together, and they try very hard in those days. Remember, this is 15th century, and they are in all the different directions, no success. And on top of that, one time the wife turned very pale, sick, and he was there for her all the time. And when she reached a moment that she see that there is really no end, she said to her young husband, if I don't make it, please start again your life, find another soulmate, another wife, and open a new chapter in your life. And unfortunately, she couldn't make it. She passed away. It was a heartbreaking funeral. And after the young husband said Shiva, did the Shaloshim, did the whole full decom of tradition, he went back to the kollel, to the setup of learning in the yeshiva of the Maharshal. And Rabbi Shlomo Luria went to him and he said, why you don't date? Why you don't meet someone? There are matchmakers in the community, try to do it. And he was like, Rabbi, I can't do it. I'm still in love with my beloved late wife. I feel very strong bond to her. I want her in my life. She is day and night in my mind and heart. And I want her to be part of my life for the rest of my life. The Marshal turns, in our language, red. And he said to him, I commanded you. I don't ask you, I commanded you to meet someone and to have the matchmaker offer you someone and go out and get married. And he says, Rabbi, I can't do it. He says, I commanded you, I don't ask you. The Torah commanded us, prurvu, be fruitful and multiply. And as you know, in our community, the sole and only reason that people get married is to have a procreation, to have children, to have a future generation. And therefore, I don't need to hear what you have to say. I commanded you to go out and do it. So, by force of circumstance, this young man had no other choice. And a matchmaker, a shadchan, offered him a girl, and they date, and they got married, not by coincidence. The same day that he married the first wife, he married the second wife, and Maharshal officiated the wedding. Very emotional wedding. And after the dancing and everything, the Marshal noticed his face was pale and he wasn't there. So the Marshal said, Marshal, as we said, is an abbreviation of Rabbi Shlomo Luria. He said to the wife and her family, go home, let me talk a little bit with him, and he will be there later. So relatively few people still was around there, and the Marshal was talking to him, and while he conversed with him, he collapsed. He just fainted, and then they check him and he's gone. And the Marshal said to Chevra Kadisha, Chevra Kadisha is a sacred society that every Jewish community had, especially in those days in Europe. They're a group of people. If it's for men, it's about 10 or more men. If it's a woman, and the group of ladies, for men, they do a tahara, which is purification of the body. Ladies does that too. And then they wrap the body with the shroud and bury the body. Unlike typical Jewish law that requires the whole process and the decorum of the Chevra Kadisha, the Maharshal said, no, I want everyone to leave, only 4 men, I want them to stay here. And he asked them to purify the body as they do the tahara. And while they purify the body, he wrote a letter. And he asked the Gabbai, the one who in charge of the Chevra Kadisha, sacred society, to forcefully open the right hand of that young man, deceased, and put his piece of paper and closed his right hand, and then wrap the body with a shroud and take it at night to the cemetery. Furthermore, Rabbi Shlomo Luria asked the 4 men of the Chevra Kadisha not to dig a grave, but instead just dig about 1 foot down, which again, it's not in the spirit or even against the Jewish law. He asked them just to carry the body to the cemetery, dig about 1 foot down, put the body down in that location, and no cover of the body, no Kaddish, no anything, just leave the cemetery. Now, we should know that this is something against Jewish tradition of, if not hundreds, you can say thousands of years. The Jewish law tells us in a very clear way what we allow, what we not allow, what we can do, what we cannot do. And here you have a community rabbi, the Maharshal, said, don't cover the grave, which is unheard of, only 4 men, only dig 1 feet, no Kaddish. We know that Levayat Hamet, that escorting the dead and helping all the management of the last person's life is one of the highest mitzvot in Judaism. And here is such a well-respected community rabbi is ruling that way. Anyway, the story goes that these 4 men did exactly the way the rabbis instructed them. And about midnight, they left the cemetery, the body unattended just down there, and went back to their home. And the Maharshal was standing there in his home entrance of his house. His home was door open of his house for the whole night, and he was just standing there and praying. And when the sun was about to rise, all of a sudden, it was a man walking toward the village with the body covered with the shrouds, just see the face, and he went straight to Rabbi Shlomo Luria's home. Rabbi Shlomo Luria, while they did all the tahara, he took his groom dress with a special pocket. He asked this man to enter his home, take off all the shroud, put back all the dress that he had from the night before, and he blessed him and he says, go home and everything will be all right. Obviously, the next day, the whole village was upside down. Everyone was talking. People have a lot of different ideas and interpretations. Some people have a great few interpretations. Others have all kind of idea of what transpired. But the Maharshal, as a community rabbi, calmed down everyone, and time healed the community. Several months later, no one even talked about it, and a little more than a year later, his wife delivered a baby boy, and it was a beautiful bris, and the Maharshal was asked to be the sandek, because you know the sandek is the one who have the baby on his lap while they do the bris. And then they have the seuda, meaning the special meal that we are doing right after the brit ceremony, which is a big mitzvah to participate in that meal. And while people finish eating and drinking and have a great spirit and great merry, the Maharshal eventually told the people what exactly transpired, which is absolutely fascinating. He said, I'm not a magician and I'm not a prophet. And the story is, when I saw this man at right after the wedding, which was exactly a date of his first marriage about 10 years ago, I decided that I, as the community rabbi, going to write a letter to Beis Din Shel Mala, to the heavenly court. And I just paraphrased what he wrote, and he said, here I am, Luria, son of so and so and so, which called by the community Maharshal. As a rabbi of this community, I commanded you, heavenly tribunal, meaning I'm not asking, I'm not beseeching, I commanded you to return this man to life. By virtue of my authority as the community rabbi, and by virtue of my authority of the community halachic man, I am the one who is responsible for his second marriage. I commanded him against his will, even he wasn't done with the previous love. I commanded him by the virtue of power of mitzvot that we receive from Moses in Mount Sinai, the Torah commanded us to be married and have children. And just because he followed my commandment, my request as a community rabbi, and I as individual and as a spiritual leader of the community, I obeyed the Torah that we received from Sinai. So by virtue of my authority, I commanded you to return him to life. Now, if you analyze it, here is a community rabbi about 500 years ago that he's not, in a way, negotiate, have a monologue or dialogue with God. He, in a way, commanded to do something. He, in a way, have the guts, the decency, the braveness, the boldness, whatever you call it, to command the heavenly court to do it. From where he gets this type of power to do such a thing. Obviously, he based it on the many stories we read in our Torah. And this is unusual example of someone that the person goes against the authority, the natural authority that he accepts upon himself, and not only that he goes against the authority or against the decision, but he even commanded us to do something. In a sense, he commanded, in this case, the heavenly tribunal, to do something in the opposite of the nature of the order of our world. If you analyze it and think what exactly we are doing on Yom Kippur before Kol Nidre, right before Kol Nidre, we are saying the Chazal, the Shliach Tzibur, said it on behalf of us, or the rabbi, they said it 3 times in the permission of heavenly court and earthly court in the presence of all the Torah. We allow even the sinner to pray with us, which means that in Judaism, the same way as Abraham and Moses and the Maharshal, people can reach those levels of spirituality, and each of us can do anything and everything. In a sense, there is a concept in Judaism that one can challenge the authority, and here and there it is a possibility, even it's rare possibility, that he or she, in a sense, win against the highest authority. I think a good example for that is something that we discussed several times, is a Talmudic discussion. And as you know, in the Talmud, most of the practice in the Talmud, it's more, in our language, for lawyers. It's a 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 rabbis argue over sometimes technical or rules and regulations and more. But here is a case in the Talmud, tractate Bava Metzia, that we discussed in the past, of a typical halachic discussion, typical argument, legitimate argument between the rabbis. It was called Tanuro Shel Achenai. In a very short, it was one great rabbi by the name of Rabbi Eliezer. All the other rabbis was opposed his opinion. And the argument was over certain oven, if it's a valid and kosher or it's not. So they argue, and Rabbi Eliezer, while the heat of an argument, said, I'm right, and in heaven can prove that I'm right. And the Talmud described how he said to them, if I'm right, guess what's going to happen? This building is going to be shaken in a moment. And before he finished his line, the building was shaking. So the rabbi said, that's not going to influence us. We'll not take that as a sign. So he said, if I'm right, look outside and you see what's going to happen to the river. And unnatural phenomena happen outside. They said, no, we don't take that seriously. Then he gets so carried away, so Rabbi Eliezer said to the sages, you know what, from heaven they will prove that I am right and not you. And something unusual happens, the Talmud describes, which is not typical to the Talmudic discussions, And a voice from heaven came and said, Rabbi Eliezer is right. So Rabbi Yoshua stood up and he shouted, we received the Torah once from Moses in heaven, and the whole reason that we have an earthly rabbinic court and earthly rabbinic authority, it's because there is, as we said before, Kol Nidre, the community leaders and the Bet Din that makes the decisions. So therefore, with all the respect, even voice from heaven, that cannot overturn our ruling. And our ruling go by the majority. And since the majority of the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and he is one opinion against the majority, if it's a single opinion versus the majority, you go by the majority. And the end of the text in the Talmud is so fascinating, not only because that text appears in both in the Babylonian Talmud and in Jerusalem Talmud, but the voice from heaven came and said, my nitzchuli banai, my sons won over me. In our language, Almighty God said that we, meaning the earthly rabbinic court, rule over the heavens. So if you think this is again is another example of something fascinating in the Jewish history in different time, that by virtue of the authority of us, individually, collectively, depend on a position and more, that can even overrule something that it's not by the nature. The same way in that sense that Moses asked God to open its earth and swallow Korach and all the others, it happens that against the phenomenon, like the story of Golem and Prague and many other stories in Jewish legends and history, talk about the capability of the authority to overturn heavenly decision. And that's in some ways the whole concept before Kol Nidre, that we get together everyone, we get all the Torahs and we get all the people, and we said by the virtue of heavenly and earthly court, we're allowed to pray with the sinner. So back to our basic question, which is, we're almost in our language post-coronavirus, at least in some way that the world was in an unclear situation for a long time, and no matter where you are, or what is your status, or how much wealth you have or you don't have, makes no difference. The virus was uncontrollable anywhere, any place, at any means. And obviously there is a message behind it, much more than just question over vaccine and more. The capability of people to handle a state of uncertainty, state of the unknown. God willing, in the next week's Torah portion of the shlach, of the way that Moses sent out 12 spies to spy out the land, and they are in a state of unknown for a period of time and return, and the majority came out with the bad report. It's dealing with the need of the clarity when people are in the desert and they're about to enter the land and they don't have full trust, and in the state of unknown, sometimes people, including the highest leaders, does something that is wrong. So sometimes all the intuitions and the inner feelings and more can be misleading, because that's the big warning sign. Anything that happens in our world, it's the way that you handle that, the way that you go on a, God forbid, you go on a plane, you're supposed to travel to Canada and it ends up in South America, in Amazonas, without any expectations. How do you respond to the unknown? How do you survive a state of uncertainty? How you deal with superstitions versus of the core, the blueprint of life, which is our Torah. The key idea is to be proactive, not to be a loser and someone who's just give up hope, but to be proactive. If you try to find a mechanism between Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah, even he wasn't successful, he tried it. Moses, he was successful convincing God not to destroy the nation. The Maharshal was successful over things. So you see throughout our history that not always was a great success, but our leaders and our people always try to make the difference, sometimes even the price to do something against all rationality, because deep in their hearts they felt that that's the right thing to do, not for themselves, but for the community or for the world. So obviously there are many messages we can take home. I think the most important one is that every single one of us can do anything and everything. The rabbis tells us, from the Rabbi of Vilna to many other great rabbis, that anyone can be Moses and Abraham and Sarah and Miriam and Rebecca. Anyone and everyone can do everything, in a sense that if we have the belief, the will, and the sincerity and the pure intent, we can reach those levels of spirituality. In Judaism, we are flesh and blood, we are human, we're not something from angelic world, and therefore anybody can do anything, and it's all connected to each other.
Anna bechoach gedulat yeminecha tatir tzerora. Anna bechoach gedulat yeminecha tatir tzerora.